this country is at war with Germany.
We shall go on to the end.
I remember the sheets of flame which came up and almost blinded us from our guns.
Hello and welcome to the World War II podcast. I'm Angus Wallace. When we talk about the Second Front, most of us think about the Allied invasion of Northwest Europe, D-Day, June 1944. But in his new book, Second Front, Anglo-American Rivalry and the Hidden History of the Normandy Campaign, historian Professor Marc Milner offers a different perspective. What if the real Second Front wasn't in Normandy, but in Washington? Milner argues that while Britain fought alongside the United States on the battlefields of Europe, it was also engaged in a very different kind of struggle across the Atlantic, a political and diplomatic battle to retain its influence over an increasingly dominant America. By the time Allied troops landed in France, the United States had not only become the senior partner in the alliance, but had begun reshaping the post-war world, often at the expense of British interests. But as we'll hear, this wasn't just about wartime politics or military planning. The roots of Anglo-American rivalry ran much deeper, stretching back to the way each nation remembered the First World War. Marc, thanks for joining me. So let's start with the First World War. How did America and British narratives of victory in 1918 diverge? Why did that matter in 1940?
Well, it's a good question. When I started working on the book, I thought I would just write one chapter to get to 1939. And by the time I had done, I'd written 500 pages in 5 chapters. And you can't start with Genesis because that would make it even longer still. Or the American Revolution for that matter. I started with the Great War because years ago, one of my students actually had done a graduate student essay on kind of perceptions of victory in the 1920s. And I was gobsmacked by the extent to which the American popular press, but even the American official press, claimed that the Americans won the Great War. You know, you could qualify that quite easily by saying, yeah, I think their entry determined the outcome of the war, because Germany having exhausted just about everybody else's empire, the Russians, the French, the Italians, and to a very considerable extent the British Empire, now all of a sudden found themselves confronting another whole continent of people and resources. And I think the psychological shock of America coming in as an associated power on the side of the Entente was critical. It's also clear that having 1 million men on the Western Front, allowing the French to recover a little bit, was critically important. So I wouldn't downplay America's contribution, but it's a long stretch to say that America won the First World War. And that's the claim that they made in the 1920s. The Brits made a similar claim that it was their push along the North Axis towards Cambrai and ultimately pushing into Belgium that pushed the Germans over the edge. And of course, Canadians, not being too modest about the accomplishments of the Canadian Corps, would tell you that the people who did the real heavy lifting in the BEF in 1918 was the Canadian Corps, which incidentally was virtually a pocket army, and I tried to explain that in the book. The Canadian Corps is not just 4 divisions; it has essentially the equivalent of 5, perhaps even 6 divisions. And Arthur Currie very smartly decides that it's better to simply augment the power of the corps that he has rather than break it up into 2 corps and create an army headquarters. And he doesn't want to try to build new staffs. If he'd done that, the combat power of his formation would have been increased marginally. So there are many conflicting claims. For most Europeans, the American claim that they won the First World War is just outrageous. And I did a little digging, and there is a pattern there. The Americans come into the war against Spain and Cuba late in the game when everybody's exhausted, and they're able to give it one good kick and the whole thing falls down. So they won that war. The same situation in the Philippines, where the Philippine insurrection has been going on for some time. Both sides are exhausted. The Americans arrive and the Spanish capitulate and the Americans win. So the similar scenario in the Great War, the effete Europeans can't figure out how to do this. The Americans arrive. The Germans capitulate. Ipso facto, Americans win. So there's a lot of hubris tied up in, who was the big dog, who did all the heavy lifting. I also wanted to explore the quite different experiences of the Anglo-Canadian, the British Empire, if you like, and the American Army. And the American Army's experience of the Great War was nothing comparable to what the Brits experienced. And I don't know how strong that thread emerges in the book, but the British experience of the Great War, don't need to remind you or your listeners, was absolutely searing. It just staggering, the impact of that war. The American war was almost, I don't want to downplay it, it's almost an adventure. If you read some of the literature, they'll tell you that the real experience of the Great War was millions of Americans joining the army and leaving home for the first time. There were no long, bitter winters and years on the Western Front watching your friends die. I don't want to belittle American casualties because they were, for the period in which they fought, they were as horrendous as anybody else. But it doesn't leave an impact on the nation. So it's a very different experience. So the Americans very clearly believe they won the First World War. And moreover, it's American money that made it possible. And those dastardly Brits welched on their debt. And so there is a residue of distrust against perfidious Albion and what he might do the next time. And it's also very clear the Brits manipulated the American media in the Great War. There's a whole legacy of mistrust and doubt, quite apart from what happens from 1776 to 1917. So I think there's a lot of scope there for somebody else who wants to pursue that even more. I tried to grab some of the threads and pull them together and create a kind of image or expectation by 1939.
And this complete aside, you had me thinking about how America sort of mythologizes its frontiersman sort of nature. And then you look at their great hero, Sergeant York, the frontiersman, and he gets a film all about it. And it sort of shapes that idea of the American frontiersman winning the war kind of thing.
And incidentally, apropos of what we were talking about before we went on air, when they shot the film Sergeant York, York did it with an Enfield, British pattern rifle made in Massachusetts. And when they shot that film, they switched it over to an American pattern Springfield rifle because they didn't want to show him using a British weapon. So there's a fair amount of insecurity there, but in America's relationship with Great Britain.
Does that create some form of rivalry going into the 30s and into that sort of 1940, making the Americans not really want to be drawn into the Second World War because of their First World War experience?
Yeah, there's a very strong, well, it's not just anti-war, it's kind of an America first, right? It's MAGA before MAGA. And it really is Middle America, the Great Plains. It's the area influenced by the Chicago Tribune and to a very considerable extent the West Coast. There's a very strong element in America that is anti-British, anti-European, but also has a fair affinity with what the Germans are trying to do in the 1930s. There are quotes from several contemporary writers that I put in the book that we don't have a beef with the Nazis, with Germany. Yeah, they're a little hard on the Jews and the gypsies and the homosexuals, and some people are getting roughed up, and they don't like people of color, but we don't either. So, we're all right. And the other, perhaps more cold and rational view from the American firsters is we can trade with anybody. Doesn't matter who's in charge of Europe. They're going to have to trade with us. We're going to have to trade with them. So, we're better off out of yet another European war. We got sucked into one in 1917 by British propaganda, and damned if we're going to get sucked into another one by British propaganda. And I think it's, you look at those early chapters that I wrote on trying to get America involved in the war. There is a strong sentiment, perhaps among New Englanders, the educated East Coast, more international crowd, that the Nazis are bad and we should help the people who are trying to stop them. And the people who have invaded France and Belgium and the Netherlands and Norway and are really rather beastly, and the Brits are doing a good thing. But that's not an opinion that's widely held across America in 1940.
In which case, does that make the whole idea of sort of Lend-Lease sort of actually a transactional interest-based American sort of idea, very American idea, which the British perhaps underestimated? They were just sort of expecting to be given stuff.
Yeah, I don't think Churchill underestimated the impact because he'd read the fine print and he knew what was going on. Lend-Lease is, I think it's the bill number is HR 1776. No accident, right? It's a bill to defend America. So what the idea is that America is going to arm the people who are fighting the Germans as a way of keeping that threat at arm's length from America. The Brits have to pay for what they can pay for. There's a clause written into two key clauses, I guess, written to do that. Britain will only be allowed to accumulate $1 billion worth of U.S. dollars or gold, and anything over that, once they get more than that amount of money stashed in the Treasury, the Brits will have to pay for whatever they get. So there's a constant kind of monitoring of the British financial situation by the Treasury Department, and when the Brits seem to be doing okay, Lend-Lease continues to move goods, but the Brits then have to pay for it. And I haven't been able to track this down, I believe the Brits paid for all the aircraft that they received during the course of the war. Interestingly, when the Russians got Lend-Lease, the Russians were allowed to accumulate $2 billion worth of gold and U.S. money. And when they were queried about this, the Americans were queried about this in the spring of 1944, Treasury Department officials said, well, Russia's not a great trading rival. You are. So the objective of Lend-Lease was not just to win the war and provide Britain with the tools to win the war, but Article 7 of Lend-Lease specified that as a result of this, the British will open up the empire to free trade. And that's what Bretton Woods was all about, the establishment of the post-war economic system. So Churchill said, I haven't been able to track down the exact quote, but he said, if the British people knew what I'd actually done in the spring of 1941, they would have hung me, because he kind of sold out the British Empire and Great Britain for a very worthwhile cause, not the least of which is getting the tools to keep the Germans off the beach. It's a perilous situation in 1940, 1941. So he cuts cards with the devil, and Britain survives, but the cost is enormous.
It's a fascinating way of looking at it as a trade transaction with more of a long-term goal than it's ever really portrayed in sort of, certainly popular history never shows it that way. It's all about hose pipes.
Well, and the most unsordid act. And when you get down into the meat and potatoes of it, it's pretty twisted. You look at what Morgenthau and Henry Dexter White are doing in the Treasury Department. The objective of their war is to take apart the British Empire and open it up for American trade. America's a great trading power, but it tends to trade at this point northwest and internally. So it's got Latin America, it's got Central America. The Americans are, it seems to me, when that coterie of American senators travels around the world in December of 1943 to see what the Brits are doing with Lend-Lease, they're pretty gobsmacked by the fact that wherever they go, the Brits are already there. There's some guy in a greasy Panama hat on the wharf, or the local newspapers published by a British consortium, or the BBC is broadcasting in town, or they go to some remote place and there's a British consulate that looks after them. The Brits are everywhere, and I think they're rather astonished by the extent to which there's British global domination, and they want to break into that. They want to break into the oil in the Middle East in particular. They need British, French, Belgian, Dutch colonial possessions so they can build a global air transportation system. America has the largest merchant fleet in the world by 1945. The Brits need to carry trade to earn foreign currency. So the Brits are under threat from America economically in a very big way.
Did Britain try to sway US public opinion? I mean, it'd been fairly successful during the First World War.
Yeah, they did. There was an effort in late 1941 to actually launch what you and I might think of as a full-scale public relations campaign. There were already Brits on the ground, but they're operating very circumspectly. They kind of pushed out information to people who asked for it from the British Library of Information in New York. But they were very, very careful not to appear to be propagandists. And then in 41, after the Russians are attacked, the Brits take the gloves off and they say, okay, enough of that. We're going to actually now be very aggressive. We're going to expand our footprint across the United States. We're going to establish the British Information Service, BIS, out of New York. We're going to have offices right across the United States. We're going to be very proactive in pushing out the British view of the war. And the result of that was a pushback from Congress and from others, and a thing called the Foreign Agents Registration Act, which was enacted in early 1942. If the documents I saw were correct, was targeted partly at the Russians because it didn't want communist propaganda circulating, but also at the British. And so once that act was passed in early 1942, the Brits basically pulled back because they didn't want to be associated. Don't forget, 42 is a midterm election year, so you got to be very careful. Didn't want to be associated with too closely with supporting Roosevelt. So they say nothing about it. But they also discover that as a result of this Foreign Agent Review Act, anybody who speaks on behalf of the British has to register as a foreign agent. So here you have America's largest ally actually restricting the ability of people who want to talk about Great Britain and its war effort in the United States by saying people like you, if you were doing blogs in those days and you were interviewing me as a Brit, you would have had to have registered as a foreign agent before you could do it. So the Americans actually squish British efforts to get the word out to the United States. The person who's supposed to do that is Roosevelt. The agreement is that Roosevelt will quietly champion Britain's war effort, and he just doesn't do it. Robert Brand, who ends up in 1944 as the key British Treasury rep in Washington, wrote his boss saying, no one in any American department will say anything nice about us because they're afraid of the backlash. So they don't say anything at all. So there really is not much of a British message. If you look at some of the volume of stuff they push out, they do push a fair amount out, but it's kind of a passive information campaign rather than a proactive one.
Slightly curious because it's a wonderful term, is British and Britain. At this period, I think there's sort of a sliding scale to it. If you think about Britain now, you think about Britain, but I think in 1940s, you potentially could also mean the empire, which would include Canada and India and all those other places. At which point, when you think about that messaging, is Britain not leveraging the fact that Canada's, a rather large nation next door to America to help try and get its message across? Because the odd thing is, the three powers, Canada's always overlooked, and I'm not quite sure where that failure comes from.
Well, Canada actually has a fairly active campaign in the U.S. I've documented a little bit of it in the book. I can't claim to have a real grip on what Canada is doing other than that Canadian messaging seems to have been a little more successful, particularly the Canadian National Film Board, which produced a series of documentaries which were distributed fairly widely in the United States. But British motion pictures don't distribute. The Americans find them a bit stodgy, and so you're not going to see, apart from Miss Miniver, you're not going to see much of anything in the American theaters. British newsreels don't get the same distribution as Canadian or American newsreels. There is a genuine bias, and I'm trying to think of the gentleman's name who went on a grand tour of America from December 43 to the spring of 44. It'll come to me. He had written the script for Desert Victory and was a very famous British writer. Anyway, he discovered that there was active disinterest in America, and when he went out to Hollywood, he couldn't even get a press conference that would report anything he had to say about the British, and he discovered that British films didn't circulate. British newsreels didn't circulate. The Americans were just not interested in hearing about Great Britain and what Britain was doing. And the contrast, the flip side of that, of course, is that American films get wide distribution in the UK. So it's kind of an uneven. I mean, one of the unique things about the difference, and the Brits have a hard time initially, I think, figuring this out. If you want to do propaganda in the UK, if you can get the BBC on side, Bob's your uncle, you're done, right? If you can get 2 or 3 London newspapers to carry your stuff, you're done. There are almost 1,000 private American radio stations in 1940. There is no single place you can go to kind of, insert here and it'll go everywhere. The New York Times is reckoned to be the most cosmopolitan paper, but its circulation is pretty well the Northeast. Chicago Tribune has a much wider circulation throughout the American Midwest. But Robert McCormick is stridently anti-British. You're not going to get much of a look in there. And the Hearst newspapers and the papers out west are they're stridently anti-British. Legacy of the Civil War or the Revolutionary War or the Depression or the propaganda problem of 1917-18? I don't know. But America was almost hermetically sealed against getting any positive information into Britain. And the flip side of that is that the Germans are enormously successful. They're just able to propagandize in America quite extensively.
How do they do it then? What are they doing differently?
Well, one of the things they're doing is they're actually working with the America First movement and channeling money into anti-war people. And when the Americans actually make this illegal, I think it's in 1941, it continues anyway under the carpet. Rachel Maddow has written a book called, I think it's called Prelude, about this period and about the infiltration of German agents and German money into the United States. One of the cool things the Germans were able to do is they often, if you believe Maddow and others, some of the text for this stuff was actually written in Berlin and then transmitted to America. And don't forget, you can transmit it on the ether, right? So you can broadcast. So speeches, storylines, messages were sent to more radical American congressmen who then read them in Congress. And much like Hansard, much like in UK and Canada, if you're a congressman, you can then have off-prints of your speech printed by the government publishing house. And then because you're a congressman, you have unlimited franking rights, unlimited mailing rights. You can actually then distribute what you said to everybody in your constituency and anybody else completely for free. So the American system actually was compromised by the Germans and used by them as a system of free propaganda for those people who were already drinking the Kool-Aid and believe that America shouldn't be in the war. At the very least, America should not be fighting on the side of the British Empire and Commonwealth. So it's a very sneaky but enormously successful campaign. And the original Committee for House On-American Activities, the DICE Committee, which we all know of as the post-war one when they went on a witch hunt for communists, actually starts, I think, in 1940 as a witch hunt against Nazi sympathizers. So the Germans continue to have a powerful influence in the United States. And as I mentioned in the book, they're so good that they actually develop a kind of feedback loop. They're able to hear what's said on the American media. They're able to find out what's said in the American press. And then the German and actually Japanese shortwave radio systems are then able to talk about that stuff the next day and reinforce it in their broadcasts. It's a really cool media environment. Somebody needs to do more work on it than me. It's pre-internet, but listen, the information is moving really rapidly around the world by previous standards. You know, you're getting information. I had one example of German media broadcasting, I think late in the day or early on the 9th of June, that the landing in the Pas-de-Calais was imminent. That was picked up off the German shortwave broadcast system, was in the Times and in the Globe and Mail in Toronto the next day. So the information is moving pretty fast, and a lot of it is disinformation, right? So it's a neat environment.
It never occurred to me that's so much harder to have that disinformation in Britain when you have the BBC. There's one person everything funnels through, and they check it before it goes out. So you can't have these sort of Chinese whispers across multiple stations.
You don't have to always tell the truth or tell all the truth, right? The BBC is respected, particularly the BBC Home Service is respected throughout Europe for its truth and its directness. But the BBC is tied in, I think, and I can't provide you a chapter and verse on this, with the deception campaign. There's some things they're not saying. I know the newspapers are reporting stuff which is supportive of the deception operation. They start talking about the importance of securing ports for the invasion, which is something that, you know, maybe if you're an amateur, armchair general kind of person, you would write and say, it's going to be really important for the Allies to secure a port. Then you discover that the Allies aren't actually bombing ports. They're not bombing Boulogne. They're not bombing Dieppe. They're not bombing Calais. They're not bombing Le Havre. They're bombing the rail system, but they're not bombing the ports. And you go, So the newspapers are talking about this. The deception operation is they're kind of mutually supporting, and then all of a sudden the Allies turn up on the beach in lower Normandy, a long way from a major port. So I think there's a lot of devious stuff going on that we are not yet fully aware of.
Thinking of the big three when they meet at Tehran in 43, is that sort of the real sort of, I don't necessarily mean turning point, but realization perhaps that Britain's been marginalized?
Yes, absolutely. Even Andy McNaughton, the commanding officer of 1st Canadian Army, said that Tehran was the key point. That's the point at which, when Roosevelt decides that he's going to have a meeting with Stalin about Eastern Europe and excludes Churchill, that's the critical point. And the tragedy for the British, and actually for the Allied war effort, is that you exclude the British. And Roosevelt actually tells Stalin that, don't worry about it. We're going to stick around maybe for a year or something. But after that, we're all going home. Not going to be here. And the Brits have a much more bloody-minded attitude towards Stalin. They don't trust him, and rightfully so. Roosevelt thinks that he can woo him with his charm and his personality. And he's pretty credulous in this meeting in Tehran. And he basically throws the British under the bus and trust the Russians to do the right thing in Eastern Europe, including Poland. It's why the Brits are pushing hard to get into the Balkans. Because the idea is, okay, the Russians are our allies, but the front and the new boundaries of Europe are going to stand where the armies meet. I think the Brits are well aware of that in ways that the Americans are not.
Yes, I could never work out whether Roosevelt's so hard to try and put a pin in on what he thinks. I'm not sure if it'd be a terrible what if that I didn't really mean to go down, but if Pearl Harbor never happened, whether Roosevelt would have ever taken the country to war.
Well, I think that's a fair question. Pearl Harbor happens and Churchill's kind of, smoking a cigar and going, I slept for the first time in 4 years or whatever it was, 3 years. But Roosevelt doesn't declare war. He waits for Hitler to declare war on the United States. So how long would Roosevelt have gone? They end up with American operations in the North Atlantic. And the expectation is that at some point the Germans will sink something or kill some Americans and the Americans will jump into the war. Well, that actually happens, but the Americans don't budge. The Americans lose a couple of destroyers and have others struck by torpedoes and nothing happens.
Well, there's another interesting point off the back of that. It's the idea of Germany first, yet if you think about the build-up for Torch and Overlord, the imbalance of power between the Allies isn't as big as one might think when you look back upon it now. Would that be fair to say?
You mean in favor of the Brits over the Americans, or?
Yeah, and I am being, when I say Brits, I'm including Commonwealth.
Yeah. I do as well. I'm a completely bipolar, like my father. If you as a Brit told him that, the Brits were great, he would have accepted that included him. But if you were an American and said the Brits were great, he would have said the British and the Canadians. Right? It's kind of a family thing. When you're inside the family, it's okay. But when somebody from outside the family refuses to differentiate between me and my dad, that's where I get annoyed. Anyway, there's no question. America is virtually disarmed in 1941. It has apart from the Navy, big Navy and growing fast, enormous. But the Army, is 1.2 million men. About 1 million of those are conscripts that they've had around for a year, and they haven't actually pulled into much of anything yet by that stage. And in fact, they're perilously close. They're only supposed to be there for a year, and when they put the vote to the Senate to keep them in indefinitely, the vote succeeds by one vote. That one vote gone the other way, those 1 million men would have been released. It's one of the great phenomena of the Second World War is the fact that if you look at America's army, it goes from basically a couple 100,000 guys in 1940 to a force of about 8 million. Is it 8 million? In about 4 years. It's a staggering amount of growth. Marshall figures he's going to have 215 divisions to play with. In the end, he does well to get 100 because there's an enormous infrastructure cost in the Army Service Force, and the Air Force expands. America has, and Marshall are only really dimly aware of how far they have to go in 1940 and 41. And so the decision to land in North Africa, when they send troops over, they're being trained. Some of them, if you believe Rick Atkinson, are being trained on the ships on the way over. The American army that's sent to North Africa, the 200,000 men that they ultimately send, is being sent to North Africa for training purposes. And most people forget that the bulk of that army actually faces west. It's backstopping the Brits against an attack by fascist Spain. The army that heads for Tunisia is predominantly British. And if the Brits had had their way, by the way, the timid, slow, plodding, unimaginative Brits, if the Brits had had their way, they would have landed much closer to Tunisia and might have actually won the race. But the Americans don't want to go that deep. So they're, 800 kilometers? That's a long way. And, they finally get there, and they're so attenuated that they're down to about a company by the time they come over Longstaff Hill. But the North African campaign is predominantly British. And the Americans get drawn into it. Elements of the Americans get drawn into it. And it's a baptism of fire. But the bulk of the American army that goes to North Africa is untrained. And it goes there to train so they can then be picked up and sent to the UK to provide the basis of that invasion of Northwest Europe force that Marshall wants to build. And incidentally, everyone talks about, we go to North Africa because it saves the British Empire. Roosevelt had ordered the U.S. Army twice before to plan for an invasion of North Africa because he doesn't want the Germans ending up in Dakar and then slipping across and turning Brazil into a fascist state and then sneaking up the back way. So he wants the Americans in North Africa for his own particular reasons. And it would be better if it had happened before the midterm elections, but they miss it by a little bit. And Roosevelt has a House, Congress, and Senate, which are problematic, not exactly unruly, but difficult. So if it happened the week before, he might have had overwhelming control of both the Senate and the House. He's not quite there. He's got more Democrats, but Southern Democrats are problematic. Anyway, it's an interesting period, but North Africa is predominantly a British battle. And I said before that if you're looking about who's fighting a global war in January of 1942, the only great power that's doing that is Great Britain, Commonwealth and Empire. They're everywhere. And in the middle of all that, they launch an invasion of Madagascar. And, it's kind of small change, but that demonstrates enormous power and enormous resources and capability at a time when America is scrambling to muster some stuff and try to hold the Solomons. And it's when you slip into narrative, straightforward narrative without doing context and, if you like, analysis, everything seems to have the same value, right? The Americans are fighting here, the British are fighting there. So it's all the same. But in 1942, it's the British Empire and Commonwealth that's basically holding the line, despite all the problems in Singapore and Hong Kong and all that kind of stuff, right? All the way from the Arctic to the jungles of Burma.
Well, you also make the point that I was aware of but hadn't really thought through is the fact that it's, Germany first, yet vast amounts of resources have been sent, American resources have been sent to the Pacific. So when you have overlord those Normandy landings and D-Day, the vast bulk on D-Day is British and Canadian, even down to most of the landing craft are British and Canadian produced landing craft, and it's the Royal Navy supporting it. But that's not necessarily what we remember. We remember more of an Allied operation. It's where our memory has sort of failed us for some reason. That memory of the day has failed us, and I appreciate that this changes afterwards. There's a shifting of power, but on that day, we seem to have forgotten that the bulk.
Yeah, I mean, I was at Pointe du Hoc about a month ago, and for the first time that I've seen commemorate the fact that the Rangers came ashore from British LCAs, right from the landing ship Ben Macri. And as it turns out, all the American Rangers landed on D-Day came ashore from British landing craft. There is a monument down there put up by the Canadian Battlefields Foundation, of which I am a member on the board, commemorating the fact that the approaches to Omaha were swept by the 31st Canadian Minesweeping Flotilla. The approaches to Utah were swept by a joint British and Canadian minesweeping flotilla, which is actually a little bit more Canadian than British. If you look at the actual op order for the Western Task Force, it lists all the Canadian ships as British. But then the Americans don't mention them anyway. And I suggested in the book that a lot of these shaping operations are missed. In the case of the naval operations, I think the shaping operations are missed because they're in a different volume of Roskill's The War at Sea. So if you're going to work on the Normandy campaign, you go with one that deals with Operation Overlord. But all the work that was done by the 10th Destroyer Flotilla and the MTBs and the Swordfish firing rockets and all that kind of stuff, it's all in an earlier volume. There is a little comment in Second Front from Henry Stimson, who arrives in July and says, "Wow, this is really operating smoothly. There's virtually no losses at sea. All the troops, convoys, ships, and everything's arriving." And she's kind of gobsmacked by the efficiency of it. And that's Bertram Russell, or Ramsey, and the Royal Navy organizing and orchestrating that. And it is a tremendous success, despite some of the problems that cropped up. But the U-boat threat is dealt with, the mine threat is dealt with, the MTB threat is dealt with. There are losses, but not very many. The biggest one being the troop ship Leopold, which is sunk off Cherbourg, I think at the end of August or early September, an American troop ship by a German submarine, which doesn't really usually get into the narrative. It didn't get into mine. I realized afterwards. I forgot to mention Leopold. A huge loss of life. But generally, it's one of those things where, if there's no action, there's no story. Sir Julian Corbett said many years ago that historians are greedy of dramatic effect and forget that naval warfare is not made up of great decisive battles. It's the quiet kind of day-to-day routine movement of stuff, which is enormously successful. 2 out of every 3 convoys that arrive off the American beach in June and July are escorted by Canadians. But, once the Army historians get ashore, they don't look back over their shoulder all that much. And I have to say that the literature on that logistical aspect of the Normandy campaign is virtually non-existent. I tried to find out how many merchant ships were involved. Cynthia Barron's book on merchant shipping and demands of war, admittedly written 70 years ago, doesn't really get down to it. They weren't asking the questions that I would like to ask now, because there's something like 200 small ships taken up from British coastal trade late in the winter of 44 to provide support, because the Americans won't provide enough LSTs. They're all going to the Pacific. So all those shots of British coasters laying on the beach in the summer of 44 comes at an enormous cost in British imports and the movement of goods within Britain.
You were talking about the idea of what history follows where the action is, or we follow the action. The British and the Canadians are heavily engaged around Caen, which I think sort of tends to get overlooked. And I don't know, I think this is probably underreported in the US perhaps at the time, and is certainly overshadowed by the US breakout. Do you think this creates sort of more of the narrative of an all-American victory that we actually now see when we think about D-Day? Or Normandy, I should say. The two sort of conflate into one now.
I think what happens, there's what's his name? I'm having a senior's moment. I got his book here somewhere. The guy who was Eisenhower's PR chief towards the end of the war. Anyway, he commented that the American media was drawn to the assault on Cherbourg like bugs to a light because there was movement. And so it's not just action. The problem with the action around Caen is it's pretty well stalemated. And I said in the book, it was hard to get people excited about yet another tank battle around Caen, right? It's important historically. It's important for the campaign. But in terms of the media, even at the time, they are drawn to movement. There was a comment, and it's in my book somewhere, about Schaeff admonishing reporters that it was all about writing down German forces. It wasn't about towns and positions captured. It was about Germans killed, wounded, and taken out of action. Well, no, actually, the media was really keen on movement. And at one point, and I have some of the documents here, Schaeff began to issue a memo listing every village, town liberated day by day. So that suggests that even Schaeff was anxious about demonstrating that, yeah, we are moving. We're liberating parts of France. So I think what happens, I'm pretty certain what happens, is that the two things, and like a Monty Python skit, three things, one thing. One is that the media drifts over to the Cherbourg campaign because that's where the action is. By action, I mean movement. And the second thing is it's really easy to get news out of the American front, on the American front, and then out of Normandy through the American press wireless station at Vouy than it is to find out what's going on the Anglo-Canadian front and get information out. Partly because the British in particular still require an escort officer and a jeep, and you have to tell them where you want to go, and they take you there and you look at it and then they drive you back. And you sit down and you type out whatever it is you type out. And then by early July, it's hard to get hard copy back to the UK unless you send it by boat. The landlines aren't working great. The wireless systems can't accommodate as much text. But you can go to the American front as long as you got your press credentials, you can go anywhere you want. You can hop a ride on the Jeep going up. You can do the reporting. You can drop on another vehicle, go someplace else, come back, type it up, and you can give it to the press wireless people at the press wireless station, which is manned by professional commercial wireless operators, and they all have teletype machines. And you can get it to New York in about 20 minutes. And in fact, you can get it quicker from the American front to New York and back to London than you can from the British front to London. They discover this. So one of the things the book wrestles with is this kind of skewed reporting pattern that's coming out of Normandy. And the guy who ran the Shape press side, a fellow named Ernest Dupuis, said the Americans won the PR war hands down because they simply had a better system of access and distribution than the British did. And I think he's probably right. The Americans aren't reporting on the Brits. The British twice are asked if they can have more American reporters attached to British Armed Forces, and the Brits say no. We don't want more Americans. In the first instance, I'm not quite sure why. They managed to attach a couple more, but there's only about 9 Americans attached to the whole British Second Army, if you exclude the ones attached to 3rd Canadian Division. And then in July, the Brits are offered more reporters. There's 40 reporters sitting at Bradley's headquarters who have come out as part of the advance party of 3rd U.S. Army. And they're not accredited to anybody yet. They can't just go out in the field because they're 3rd Army reporters, and 1st Army's in the field, and Patton hasn't arrived. So they're all sitting around the press headquarters getting bombed and complaining about the locals. So there's lots of American press around, and they want to send some of those, I think those guys, over to 2nd British Army and let them report on what the Brits and the Canadians are doing. And the British say no. There's an American reporter for the New York Times, a guy named Daniel, who writes a little note for the New York Times and said the real reason is that the Brits are under pressure from the British Press Association to make sure that every little British newspaper, daily or weekly across the British Isles, has a reporter in theater first before any Americans are appointed. The British Army throughout the whole war has always been a little bit leery about having media around. They don't trust them. I don't think they trust them to report accurately, and they may not trust them to not release or reveal secrets. The Americans are completely wide open about that kind of stuff, for better or for worse. But it means that they get the press.
And I guess, oddly, again, this comes back to the First War, perhaps. When you talk about war of movement, it's a war of modernity, or it's a reaction to it's not a war of the First World War. We're moving. Whereas I guess at Caen you could go, it's a bit like the First World War. We're not moving. It's the British again, stuck.
It's the British and the Canadians fighting the Somme with tanks. It is a war of attrition. And if you look at Montgomery's strategy and Dempsey's strategy, they actually conceive of it that way. The idea is to write down German forces, to destroy them. And when Epsom falls apart in late June, and it looks like 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions are going to arrive on the battlefield, and the British will not be able to go any further. In the twinkling of an eye, Dempsey and Montgomery agree to flip Epsom from being an attack to being a defensive battle, and turn it around and kill huge numbers of Germans and destroy large numbers of German tanks. which is kind of the British doctrine, the Anglo-Canadian doctrine. You take a spot that the Germans want, you lay on a massive firepower support. This is 1917-18, bite and hold all over again. And you kill the Germans when they come to counterattack you because that's their doctrine.
What's interesting, you make this point right at the start of the book, which I'm not sure you did later on. This is Montgomery, what he did in 1917. He planned these big battles, big artillery, but he's not there right at the end for 1918. He's in Italy when the Canadians, and they're doing this rapid movement and moving things forward. And I've often wondered if the idea of Epsom, Monty actually wanted a big breakthrough battle. Why else would you name it after a horse race if it's going to be not a big breakthrough and a dash? Why would you call it Epsom and then Goodwood if it's just going to be a battle of attrition?
Well, Goodwood is a great deception operation, and maybe he thought the Germans would believe that. Epsom was meant to be a great dash, I agree. But in that sense, the British are more adaptable to the situation. Andy McNaughton, the Canadian Army commander until the end of 1943, and a great gunner from the First World War, claimed to his dying day that Montgomery never understood artillery and he used it incorrectly in Normandy. And I've never been able to find out what he meant by that. McNaughton, as you may know from reading the book, was not liked by his peers in the Canadian Army. But I often wonder, and I'm a kind of a lone voice in this in Canada, how First Canadian Army would have fought differently under McNaughton. He's not going to go to Berlin in the afternoon, but he has a very sophisticated understanding of artillery. And if you look at what Canadian Corps is doing with artillery in the 100 Days campaign, particularly after crossing the Canal du Nord, it's incredibly sophisticated stuff. I had a grad student who did an really good MA thesis on the effort to maintain continuous fire support as the Corps actually fanned out across that plain in front of Cambrai, in front of Bourlon Wood. You know, the advent of galloping batteries to provide support, the movement and the development of medium artillery fire support once you're beyond the range of field artillery, the movement up of trench mortar systems. And the whole idea that you would stop at, I don't know, it's the fall, so you stop probably at about, when it starts turning dark, about 7:30, 8 o'clock. And then somebody at the staff at the back actually writes up a fire plan for tomorrow morning at 6 o'clock, while the engineers are doing a dumping program around the advanced batteries that are God knows where. Somebody told them where they were, out on this plain, so that by 6 o'clock the next morning, the field artillery not only has a fire plan to support the next movement, the medium artillery has a fire plan to support the movement beyond the range of the field artillery. The dumping program has dumped the shells that you need to fire those programs, and the next morning you can start. That's not the Great War that most people understand. That's a remarkable accomplishment. I don't see a lot of that kind of sophistication in the use of artillery in Normandy. There's a huge amount of artillery, and they fire a prodigious amount of shells. You compare to what the Americans are using, and the American artillery allocations are puny by comparison. But it's not sophisticated, and that may be what Andy McNaughton was talking about.
Richard Dannett and Rob Lyman write about how the British forget that victory, and that the army institutionally forgets what it was doing at the end of the war, and so it goes into the Second World War very much fighting this idea of 1917 type battles with big artillery and tanks, but it hasn't got that dexterousness of those very closing months of the war where the British Army is at its peak of its ability. And oddly, that's what the Germans have picked up on and they're using against us, but we've forgotten.
Yeah, my old mentor, Dominic Graham, who was a gunner, British Army, used to put it down to the fact that the volumes of Edmund's official history that dealt with 1918 were not published until, I think, 1944 or 45. So if you wanted to go back and find an example of what you were doing, even in the official history, it's going to be the mid-Great War period, 1916, as you say, 17 at best, but you're not going to get the really sophisticated stuff, which is published too late for people to either remind themselves of or to inform themselves of.
Yeah, and it now no longer fits our cultural idea of the First World War, which is essentially Blackadder's some sort of documentary.
Yes. Well, I often thought One of my favorite books on the Great War is actually Lynn MacDonald's Last Man Standing? It's the one on 1918. And it's a Great War fought out of trenches, on the move. And it is so untypical. It's so refreshingly different. It's World War II fought without radios and tanks, essentially, and a lot of mechanization.
What are the long-term consequences of Britain sort of losing this second front with Washington?
That's a very good question, and I think you could probably argue it two ways. I don't know that Britain, as a great power, could have survived the Second World War, whether the Americans were intent on torpedoing it or not. It's a moot point. Sir James Grigg, who's the Secretary of War, visits Montgomery and says, it's 1713 all over again. We're gonna win this war like the Dutch did, and we're gonna lose our empire. How could that have been done otherwise? There's some suggestion in the post-war literature, when they got around to talking about settling Lend-Lease, that if the Americans had saw this less as us giving you the tools to finish the job, and more a case of paying British, Commonwealth, Russian soldiers to man American equipment, flip the debt, then Britain would not have accumulated, I think the debt Peter Clark has this in his book, The Last 1,000 Days. I think Britain's accumulated debt in 1945 is 107 billion US dollars, which is, when you consider that the average, the British budget, entire British budget in 1939 for the whole country was 7 billion US dollars. It's a staggering amount of money. A lot of that debt is actually owed to India, to Egypt, to Australia, to New Zealand. Not Canada. We managed to prosper largely as a result of being tied close to the American market. And we give Britain a couple $2 billion over the course of the war as, and here, have some money and have some stuff. But Britain is just, Clark says it's the most indebted country ever in the history of the world. So could Britain have fought the Second World War without basically selling its soul to Lend-Lease and to American production? I don't think so. I think Britain would have been pretty well gutted had they been able to beat the Germans without American help. And I don't think they could have. And it probably would have meant that the Russians would have been at Calais and operating out of Cherbourg. So, it's a tough one, but the decline of the British Empire does not begin with the Second World War. Arguably, it begins in 1914. And Britain's at its greatest extent in 1918, 1919, 1920. But the bedrock of Britain's economic strength has already been eroded. The sterling is weak, and Britain has had to trade off a lot of its overseas investments during the course of the First World War in order to buy war materials it needed to fight that war. So its investments are pretty well substantially reduced. And then one of the things the Americans do under Lend-Lease, of course, is to divest Britain of virtually all of its investments in the United States.
Yes, that was fascinating.
Right. So how do you generate American dollars after the war if all of those great investments that you had in the U.S. no longer exist? And it's actually quite scandalous. I put in the story of American Viscose, which is a big British company that produced nylon and some other stuff. And it basically got sold for 50 cents on the dollar. And a lot of the war industry that Britain, had built in the United States, which is quite extensive. The Brits have invested something like 800 million US dollars in the American aircraft industry by 1941. They were all taken over by the US government or by American corporations at the rate of about 10 cents on the dollar in terms of its value. So the Lend-Lease not only creates indebtedness, it undermines Britain's ability to generate wealth in the post-war period. So it's kind of a double-edged sword that way. There is reverse Lend-Lease, providing the Americans with, bases and British shipping and railways and all that kind of stuff. But it never amounts to much more than about a tenth of the value of the materials that Britain has received under Lend-Lease itself.
So the US essentially leverages the war to make itself the global hegemon that Britain perhaps once was.
Absolutely.
And is that how intentional do you think that was?
I think it was completely intentional. I think that was the objective. By 1944, America has something like 3/4 or not 80% of the world's gold sequestered in Fort Knox, right? And the whole world's flipping over to American dollars. When the British sign off on Lend-Lease, the Americans say, right, well, we're going to go to Canada and get their gold. And the Canadians go, no, you're not. You're not getting our gold. You're not getting the French gold that's in Ottawa, because we didn't sign this agreement. We are not Britain. We are Canada. We're an independent country. Oh yeah, I forgot about that. But they actually have, they sent a cruiser to South Africa to pick up British gold that's been sequestered there. By the time they're talking about it, the American ships are already out around the world picking up British bullion and moving it to the United States. Whatever Britain had in the piggy bank has been put on the table and, pushed over to the dealer. It's gone. The investments in the United States, gone. The investments in Latin America largely disappeared, I think, and I stand to be corrected on this, in the Great War. All the investment in railways and mining and infrastructure in Argentina and Chile and Peru, all gone in the First World War. Now they're all gone from America in the Second World War and further afield too. America prospers. And in my darker moments, I think, yeah, because if you can suck the life out of the world's largest empire, literally draw its wealth out, like you put a tube in and turn the pump on, it all comes back to you. You can prosper. And the Americans do, by the way. They continue to produce. There's complaints about rubber rationing and gasoline rationing and not enough candy bars and that kind of stuff. But America in 1945 is booming. Its internal economy is very strong. And it controls virtually all the world's gold. The world's economy has shifted from pound sterling to the U.S. dollar. They control the largest merchant fleet in the world. The world is America's oyster in 1945, and it's quite deliberate. And, it's not a case of blaming America for wanting to be great. That doesn't make them any different from any other great power. The fact that they did that not exclusively on the back of the British Empire, but they used the war as an opportunity to establish themselves. And what's interesting about that, I think, is that American isolationists actually flip from being isolationists to being imperialists. There's this kind of notion that, okay, well, if we can't live without the world, we might as well run it. So there's virtually no American isolationists left. They all become American imperialists. And there's discussions in 44 about, how much of this are we going to keep? What are we going to give back to the French? Will the Dutch get? No, we won't let the Dutch have that. We'll keep this. We'll keep that. And one of the reasons why there's a push right after the war to bring Newfoundland into Canada is to prevent the Americans from adding it to the lower 48. Seriously. When they do the referendum, I think it's in 1949. It's a very close run thing. And there is suggestion even at the time that the British government and the government in St. John's has manipulated the vote to ensure that the Newfoundlanders vote to join Canada, not the United States. Because you don't want to surrender more of the empire to the Americans than you already have.
Very good. Well, now we've reached the end of the war. That seems like a good place to wrap things up. Thanks, Mark. As I said before, I really enjoyed your book. Loyal listener, if you'd like to read more about the political machinations between the US and Britain, Mark's book is Second Front, Anglo-American Rivalry and the Hidden Story of the Normandy Campaign. And don't forget, if you like to support the podcast, get ad-free listening and access to extras that didn't make it into the final cut, you can become a patron at patreon.com/WW2podcast. And it's a big thank you, as always, to those of you who already support the show. Well, that is it for this episode. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.
Jerry 88mm gun hit our town, blew us the hell out of it.
Stalingrad can never be repaired.
As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice.